Hello everyone and welcome to our event. My name is Miriam Kamali and this is our first ever deep dive event where I'm really pleased to be joined by Monica Burns, our fantastic Freedom United campaigner, and Joanna Hewitt-James, our Executive Director, to dissect a selection of the Freedom United community's top campaigns. So we asked you in the community what you would like this conversation to focus on, and based on what you said, we're going to be exploring campaigns including slavery in Libya, child exploitation in cocoa, orphanage trafficking, and Uyghur forced labour. Most importantly, we are holding this space for you in the community to get involved in the conversation, ask us questions, and learn more about how we can progress our collective campaigning in 2022 and beyond. So after each campaign debrief, we are going to open the floor to questions. Please drop in any questions or comments in the chat box and Q&A section on Zoom throughout the event at any point. And when we open the floor for questions, and if you would like to speak, please raise your hand. There should be an option at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and I will then unmute you. It may also appear as a request to speak. So if you can see that at the bottom of your screen, just click on that. And for those of you tuning in on Facebook Live, please drop your questions in the Facebook chat box and we'll make sure to answer as many as we can. We will also be live tweeting on Twitter if you'd like to follow us at Freedom United HQ. So before we jump in, we have a really quick anonymous poll for you guys on Zoom on what you think of the EU's response to Libya. So I'll just launch the poll and it would be great if you guys can just share what you think. Just a quick yes or no, or tell me more. So the poll should be launched. You should be able to click on your answers. So why are we asking you this question? In recent weeks, the spotlight has been put on the EU's discrimination as we've witnessed the stark differences between the EU policy rightly being more welcoming to Ukrainian refugees on the one hand, and on the other, forcing migrants to remain in conditions of slavery in Libya. So Monica leads on our advocacy calling out the EU and its role in perpetuating slavery in Libya and the horrendous, inhumane conditions that migrants are subjected to in the country's notorious detention centres. So Monica, can you give an overview on the EU's response to Libya and give us a sense of what's going on there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Miriam. So yeah, I guess it's good to just start out by saying, obviously, and as you've mentioned, we find the EU's initial response to Ukrainians fleeing danger extremely commendable. I mean, within days of Russia's invasion, EU states decided to activate the Temporary Protection Directive, which gives any Ukrainian national the right to live and work in the EU for up to 3 years. So let's see and let's hope that they're now going to follow through with the funding, logistics and support that's actually needed to pull that off in a safe and effective way. But as you say, the EU response did highlight for us there's the sort of double standards that we're seeing in terms of how the EU treats people fleeing danger in different parts of the world. So, I mean, this was already really visible at the Ukrainian borders, right? I mean, there were multiple reports of African students being stopped at the borders from crossing. And even once allowed into the EU, only Ukrainian citizens are actually eligible for this temporary protection, which means that people who are displaced living in Ukraine are at risk of being sent back to their countries of origin. So sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat today, so apologies for advance for any coughing. And I think it's also, just before we move on to Libya, it's also important to point out as well that on these same borders, so on the Polish border, for example, for years, and even still continuing today, we've seen endless reports of violent pushbacks, of people fleeing wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and so on. So I think, yeah, it really gives us a sense, like quite a stark picture of different treatment of refugees. So that brings me finally to Libya. So how is the EU responding to people fleeing danger in Libya, is what you asked, I think. So I think it is important for us to remember that a lot of the people who are in Libya have also fled situations of conflict and violence in their home countries in places like Sudan, Chad, Eritrea. But the response to them is completely different. Instead of enabling them to travel safely across Europe, granting them the right to work and live there, the EU has created what has come to be known as like a sort of shadow immigration system, by supporting the Libyan authorities to keep people away from European shores really at all costs. So this partnership was formalised when a memorandum of understanding was signed between Italy and Libya, backed by the EU in 2017. And despite years of evidence of the enslavement and torture of migrants and asylum seekers in Libyan detention facilities, the MOU was extended without amendments in 2020. So Libya is receiving a lot of funding from the EU for this migration management. And the Libyan Coast Guard in particular has received boats, cars, radios, uniforms, training, etc., to basically strengthen their capacity to intercept people in the Mediterranean and return them to Libya. And that's happening even though the EU knows fine well what will happen to people who are returned to Libya.
Thank you, Monica. That's a really helpful overview of what's happening at the moment and the EU's response, which seems entirely inadequate and beyond just being inadequate, actively harmful. So thank you everyone for also filling out the poll. I'm just going to share the results. The majority of you said, yes, you do think the EU should revise its migration policy and take responsibility for slavery in Libya. So we're going to open the floor now to questions from you guys. So if you have any questions, please share them in the chat. But Monica, I think one question that we have received many times is, how are people migrating across Libya and seeking to reach Europe experiencing trafficking and slavery?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously, for starters, there are some people who have been trafficked to Libya from their home countries. Sorry. So we recently partnered actually with a Nigerian organization called Girls Inspired, and they've worked with a lot of women who have been through this exact experience. So they were told by traffickers that they would be given, a well-paid job, a visa abroad, and so they trusted them, and then were taken to Libya, where they were sold to criminal groups, tortured. Their family money was extorted from their families. They were faced forced labor, abuse, and so on. But that's obviously not the case of everyone. Lots of people go to Libya either to get better opportunities there, or as a sort of transit point towards the EU. And when in Libya, lots of people are rounded up in basically arbitrary mass waves of arrests, or intercepted in the Mediterranean and returned. And then they're basically taken to migrant detention facilities, which some of them are run by the sort of semi-official state authorities, but also some are sort of invisible sites, which are run by armed non-state actors. And there they experience really extremely inhumane conditions. They lack access to hygiene facilities, food, ventilation even, and they're often face abuse, violence, and are sold, their labour is sold to other people outside of the detention facilities, or in some cases they are just sold on. to other criminal groups and so on. And if anyone wants to hear a bit more about this situation, I would really recommend following Refugees in Libya. That's the name, at Refugees in Libya, on social media, and also watching their YouTube live streaming that they did a few weeks ago, where they people with lived experience of what's going on in Libya telling, giving some really emotive accounts of what's happened to them, and also, expressing solidarity with Ukrainians, and also saying, and now what about us as well? We also need this treatment. So I would really recommend checking that out to get a bit more detail on that. I have a glass of water here.
Thanks so much, Monica. So what changes are we calling for, and what do we need to see if people migrating across Libya are to be better protected from egregious human rights abuses that they're suffering at the moment?
Yeah, so we're calling for a few changes. Obviously, we're calling on the EU and its member states to stop supporting the Libyan Coast Guard and to push for the closure of all migration detention centres in Libya and evacuate anyone who is in need of evacuation. But also to set up a disembarkation and relocation mechanism for people rescued in the Mediterranean that is not tied to the Libyan Coast Guard. So these goals are obviously quite ambitious, but we think that this reaction to Ukraine is like a really key opportunity for this movement, because I think it's really proved that when there is a political will, there is a way to help these people who are in need of refuge. And we are actually seeing some positive steps. I don't know if people have seen it, but just a few weeks ago, Germany announced that they will stop military training for the Libyan Coast Guard due to concerns over their treatment of migrants. So they're ambitious goals, but there is some movement there.
Great, thank you so much, Monica. I think it's interesting because having considered all of this and that really excellent explanation that you've given, it seems evident that not just in Libya, but around the world, there is a lack of safe migration routes. And when we see that combined with punitive immigration policies, we're seeing that these are actually contributing to increasing vulnerabilities to human trafficking and modern slavery for people on the move. Not only that, but for people who are trafficked across borders, the support that they find in the destination country is severely lacking. So despite claims by governments, we're seeing this a lot in the UK at the moment, that tighter border controls will supposedly prevent human trafficking, will supposedly bust the business model of criminals and criminal gangs. What we're seeing is the opposite is true, right? So evidence, of course, points to people who cross borders, who are forced to cross borders in irregular ways. They're actually at greater risk of exploitation because they are forced to take routes that are incredibly dangerous in order to get around these really tight immigration controls. Undocumented migrants, people who cross borders who may not have the correct legal documentation, they are at high risk of being detained, held in prison-like settings that have been, likened to conditions that really put people's mental health at risk, increase suicide risk. And furthermore, they're put at risk of deportation straight back into the conditions that they were fleeing in the first place. And all of this for merely having crossed a border. So this fact, traffickers know that this fear is a really useful tool that they are able to exploit in order to force desperate people into exploitation. They know that victims won't seek support from authorities given their insecure immigration status. And this is something that is really playing into the hands of traffickers. So when we think of these harmful immigration policies, as I mentioned, in the UK right now, there's the really inhumane Nationality and Borders Bill that's being debated right now and going through Parliament. it will make it both harder for trafficking victims to access support that they are entitled to, and that states are, obliged to provide to them under international law, and in fact increases risking trafficking, making it easier than ever for traffickers to exploit people. And people that are made vulnerable, they're not, migrants and people on the move aren't inherently vulnerable, but they are made vulnerable by this systematic denial of their rights through these immigration policies we're seeing. So having said all of that, I mean, from the way that we see it, is that governments around the world, they must stop using this anti-trafficking rhetoric to promote support for these harmful immigration policies that are increasing trafficking. We really want to know what you and the Freedom United community and everyone tuning in, what you think about increasing safe migration routes, open borders. Please share your questions and thoughts either in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to speak. We'd love to hear from you. One question that we have received is, what is an alternative to the UK's recent announcement to send people seeking asylum to Rwanda? So this is relating to, for those of you who don't know, under new plans that were announced last week, the UK government proposes to send single men attempting to cross through irregular migration routes into the UK to Rwanda. Now, this plan is inhumane and cruel for many reasons, but as it relates to trafficking, we know that it won't deter, first of all, people from seeking safety in the UK. All it will do is increase people's vulnerability to trafficking and exploitation, and people won't be encouraged to use safe migration routes. These largely don't exist. So instead, what we're going to see is people being pushed into even more desperate situations and being forced into situations where accepting offers from traffickers is one of their few, if not their only option. Not to mention, we've seen a ton of reports in the media as well, how a very similar deal between Israel and Rwanda actually saw the majority of people leave Rwanda to make the journey to Europe regardless, and many people ended up trafficked. So the alternative to this policy that is, not only horrendous and inhumane, but also completely nonsensical, is for the UK and all states to adopt human rights-based approaches to immigration policy. These include safe migration routes, ensuring migrants' rights and trafficking victims' rights are respected and upheld, and from a very human level, that people are not treated with contempt. So while you share your thoughts, we're going to take a closer look at the campaign to end Uyghur forced labour. So, Joanna, we know that people belonging to ethnic, cultural and religious groups in northwestern China, including Uyghurs, are currently the target of the largest organised detention of an ethno-religious minority we've seen since World War II, and since 2017, over 1 million people have been detained in China. Can you give an overview of what's happening in Freedom United's campaign calling on the Chinese government to free Uyghurs from forced labour?
Yes, thanks, Miriam. Sure, I mean, the situation in the Uyghur region is serious. The peoples of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in northwest China, known to locals as East Turkestan, are largely from Turkic ethnic groups, and they've long been persecuted for their ethnicity by the government, which have repressed their language, religion, and culture. And in recent years, the government of China's efforts to oppress and forcibly assimilate people from these groups, like the Uyghurs, has expanded dramatically. So you might have seen survivor accounts, leaked official documents, and satellite imagery all confirm that the Chinese government is subjecting hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and others to systematic forced labour in detention camps, prisons, and factories, forcing them to be loyal to the Communist Party, to renunciation of Islam, constant surveillance and torture. They're among some of the really horrifying conditions that have been they're facing, and some have described the government's actions as genocide. And in terms of forced labour, Detainees are forced to work under constant surveillance with assigned minders and no freedom to leave. Their forced labour contributes to the production of goods for numerous multinationals. And in fact, experts argue that forced labour is so widespread in the Uyghur region that all goods produced there should be considered tainted. So naturally, we're really horrified by this situation. And so in April 2020, we launched a petition calling on the Chinese government to free Uyghurs from forced labour. And we came together with other concerned organisations to form a coalition to end forced labour in the Uyghur region so that we could coordinate our efforts. And the coalition has well over 190 organisations from 36 countries, including over 70 Uyghur groups. And Freedom United sits on its steering committee. The first objective for our coalition was to call on brands to exit the Uyghur region. So brands, like your high street shops, particularly those using cotton in their products, so fashion companies and apparel industry. We want to make sure that they were not benefiting or supporting from the forced labour system, and also to, of course, apply pressure on the Chinese government to act to end this practice. Countless Western companies are profiting from the system of forced labour in their supply chains. And to get an idea of scale, over 20% of the global apparel industry cotton supplies, the apparel industry's cotton supply is grown in the Uyghur region. So it's massive business. 84% of China's supply of cotton is grown in that province. So we created different actions calling on leading brands and retailers to ensure that they're not supporting or benefiting from this pervasive and extensive system. So I think some of you probably taken action on our website to Nike, Uniqlo and Zara, just 3 brands in particular that we've picked out who aren't doing enough to show that they're not complicit, and asking them to exit the region. And more recently, we launched an action to Urban's CEO, that's the owner of Urban Outfitters and Anthropology, among other brands, urging him to end all business relationships with suppliers benefiting from forced labour, and to be transparent about who are they sourcing their products from, who are the companies that are in their supply chain. So we're asking companies to sign a call to action which sets out steps towards this objective, and to make that commitment public. And the steps are to stop sourcing raw materials, inputs or finished products from the Uyghur region, to cut ties with companies implicated in forced labour, so those who have links or operations in the Uyghur region, or who have accepted government subsidies and or government supplied labour at these operations, because there's also a programme of moving labour around the country. So these forced labourers are actually shipped. It's called a transfer programme. And also to prohibit any supplier factories that are outside the Uyghur region from using these workers. And that's the labour transfer scheme that I just mentioned. So a year after launching the call to action, a well-known UK brand, Marks & Spencer, signed the coalition's call to action, became the first major fashion retailer to publicly commit to ending all sourcing from the Uyghur region, which is brilliant. And several other fashion brands have since signed the call to action as well, including ASOS and Eileen Fisher. There's still a lot more to sign though. And we've also have gone in for Apple. So you can write directly to Tim Cook, the CEO, and ask him to end all business relationships with suppliers that support and participate in this Uyghur forced labour system. And we've also called for them to support the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act. So Mr. Cook of Apple last year told US Congress that forced labour is abhorrent, yet several Apple suppliers operating in China have been implicated in this Uyghur forced labour system. So the role of Freedom United community has been across a wide range of activities and really helped support some of these steps of progress that we've had. We've got more than 112,000 people who've signed the petition calling on brands to exit the region. And some of you also might got involved in the Nike action which was calling on Nike to publish a human rights impact assessment of its entire global supply chain. so that we can really understand and evaluate whether it has connections or links to the Uyghur forced labour system. Now, the resolution itself wasn't passed, but we got a really significant vote in favour, and that puts pressure on Nike's management to seriously consider how they can really expect their backers to continue to accept their lack of due diligence and public declaration of what's happening in their supply chain. So that's been a really important action. And also in December last year, President Biden signed the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act just 1 week after it passed Congress. And that new law bans the import of all goods from the Uyghur region into the US unless companies can offer verifiable proof that the manufacturing process does not involve forced labour. So we're really happy with the progress, the achievements that we've managed to secure so far, but we're conscious that we need to be doing a lot more to continue this fight and to actually end this system. So, we're constantly looking for new and innovative ways to make sure that this issue doesn't just fall out of the spotlight, and that we can continue putting pressure to make sure we're gathering as much strength as possible in the campaign.
Thanks so much, Joanna. And it's really encouraging and inspiring to hear over the last few years how this global community has really come together to, really push for significant progress in this campaign. We'd love to hear from everyone tuning in, whether you have any comments or questions on the campaign to end Uyghur forced labour. We know that, so many of you in the Freedom United community have already taken action, whether it was signing the petition or writing to businesses, writing to fashion brands, writing to tech brands. One question, Joanna, that we do get is, what can the Freedom United community do to maintain this pressure on businesses and, governments implicated in the forced labour of Uyghurs?
So companies generally respond to their market, and that's why targeting brands is really helpful, because they obviously have economic leverage. But also they're sensitive to the opinion of their either consumers or potential consumers, and generally their brand reputation. So the only way that that's important is if we ask the questions. If we're constantly asking them to show us how they're not linked and they're not complicit in the forced labour system, then it becomes something they can't ignore. But we have to keep asking the questions and keep engaging. And that's why when we come together and we ask those questions en masse, or we get other people to help us do it. So like, for example, the example I gave for Apple and likewise Nike, where we ask the shareholders to ask questions, it really builds pressure up on the companies to realize that actually it's not acceptable to just produce goods and not worry about the conditions in which they've been made. That actually you have a responsibility to ensure that they are produced in conditions which don't include exploitation. So it's really important that we keep making it clear what standards we expect from companies that that are out there. And whether you're a customer or not, it's not actually as important as just setting a clear expectation of what our standards are, and that it's totally unacceptable to suggest that because it's in another country or it's further down your supply chain, that it's not your concern. It absolutely is, and there's legal evidence that shows you can be held to account for abuses of human rights, such as forced labour in your supply chain.
Thanks, Joanna. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's so important for us as a community to be keeping up that pressure, making sure that we are maintaining this issue in the spotlight. So please do, take action, make sure that we are sending these messages out, make sure that, our voices are heard, because we do know that it makes a difference. So moving on to chocolate and exploitation in the cocoa sector, Monica, how does exploitation and child trafficking occur in the chocolate supply chains?
Yeah, so at the root of the issue is really farmer poverty. So currently, most cocoa farmers are not earning a living wage. On average, cocoa farmers earn less than $1.20 a day, which is less than half the living wage. So to make ends meet, farmers turn to cheaper labour sources, which can often involve children. So in some cases, it can involve exposing children to what is known as hazardous child labour, in which they're conducting dangerous tasks like carrying heavy loads, using machetes, or handling or being exposed to pesticides. It can also involve being put to work against their will. So I don't know if anyone here saw the Dispatches programme that was aired in the UK a few weeks ago that had one particular case, which was a girl who was saying, you know, that she was there against her will. And in other cases, it can actually involve children being trafficked from neighbouring countries and regions like Burkina Faso and Mali, and made to work on a cocoa farm.
Thank you, Monica. And, you know, when we think about the role that chocolate companies play, how do chocolate companies, you know, how can they address child slavery in cocoa, and what are their responsibilities? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, when you remember that chocolate companies, not unlike what Joanna was talking about with fashion brands, chocolate companies are making enormous profits from an industry that's causing significant harm to people and the planet. So it really is their responsibility, we think, to work with farmers and also organizations and cooperatives that represent them to really transform the industry. So there are 6 different things that we are calling on chocolate companies to do. The first one is to really address this underlying issue of farmer poverty by paying a fair price for cocoa. And that's not something that's easy. It involves being able to know who your farmers are, know what they earn, know how much they would need to, how much you would need to pay for cocoa for them to be able to earn a living wage. And then obviously make the changes within the distribution of funds in your company. But some companies are doing that, and some companies are getting there. So it can be done. So it's really important that we insist upon that, because really without tackling this root issue, we're going to struggle to make any sort of changes on other areas. The second area that we're focusing on is asking companies to scale up child labour monitoring and remediation systems. And that would be to scale these systems across 100% of the cocoa they source. Thirdly, we're asking companies to increase traceability and transparency. So obviously, if a chocolate company doesn't know where its cocoa is coming from, then they can't know how ethical the practices are in their supply chain. And although companies are, you know, making progress on this issue, we're still quite far from achieving full traceability. So around half of the cocoa from the companies evaluated in the 2022 Chocolate Scorecard is still coming from indirect suppliers, so untraceable, or untraced rather. So then next, we're also calling for an end to deforestation. In the last 60 years, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, which are the countries the world's leaders in the production of cocoa, they have lost around 94% and 80% respectively of their forests, and around a third of that loss is thought to be linked to the cocoa sector. So obviously, I mean, tomorrow's World Earth Day, and I think we all know that wiping out native forests is not good for anyone. But also, there's research out there that links deforestation to an increased demand for labour, which also then brings us back to the issue of having to turn to cheaper labour sources, including children. Number 5 of our asks is around pesticide use. So pesticides obviously pose a risk to the health of the adults and children working on farms, but also to the nearby communities and to communal resources like soil and water. And then lastly, our last ask, which kind of it's really our first ask and kind of sums up the rest, is around preventing child trafficking and forced child labour. So all of these shifts will be costly, and in some cases there is a risk of pushing some farmers out of business even. So it's really, really important that companies work directly with farming communities to find really farmer-centric solutions, and to really ensure that that the farmers are not bearing the additional costs of these new policies.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, that's incredibly important. I'm just going to pause here just to give everyone just a chance to share questions, raise your hand if you'd like to get involved in the conversation. I'm happy to unmute you if you'd like to speak. Monica, you've done some really great work recently with partners around the 2022 Chocolate Scorecard. Can you give a bit of an overview of some of the learnings from that scorecard and what it means for those of you who don't know?
Sure. So yeah, just to give everyone the background in case people haven't seen the Chocolate Scorecard. The Chocolate Scorecard is an annual thing. So this year it surveyed 38 of the world's largest chocolate companies, and that accounts for around 80 to 90% of the global chocolate products, and includes brands like Mars, Nestle, Lindt, Mondelez, Ferrero, so really big names in there as well. And the scorecard ranks companies on 6 different areas, so traceability and transparency, living income policies, child labour, deforestation and climate, agroforestry, and agrochemical management are the different areas that you can see ratings on for each company. And this year's scorecard shows that there has been some real improvement over the last few years. For example, I was talking earlier about some of our asks being around child labour monitoring and remediation schemes. And this year we found that most companies do have a scheme like this or an equivalent system in place. But there is still more to be done, obviously, to eliminate child exploitation from cocoa. So, for example, in this specific point, these systems only operate in the direct supply chain. So indirect sourcing can still amount to 50% or more of an average company's supply chain. So that means they're getting cocoa from farms where this monitoring is not in place. So it's really important that this indirect space is shrunk. In terms of specific brands, because I know people like to hear the details, the industry does continue to be led by brands like Beyond Good, Tony's Chocolate Only, Alter Eco, and Whittaker's. Sorry, but there's also been some special mentions to Ferrero and Nestle this year for some improvements that they've made within their supply chains. So yeah, I would really recommend though that you go to chocolatescorecard.com. I think we've just dropped it in the chat, and check out the whole scorecard because it's got lots of interesting points in it.
Great, thank you, Monica. So we have one question from the audience. What role do consumers play in addressing child slavery in cocoa?
Yeah, so again, I think a lot of this is echoing what Joanna has said about the Uyghur campaign, but part of the beauty of Freedom United community is the power, people power aspect, and I think the chocolate campaign is one where that is so important, and that we are directly targeting these brands, and so brands need to hear what their consumers care about. And if we're not telling them, then they'll just assume that we don't care about it, right? So we also need to push for more transparency and for brands to be held accountable for their improvements. So I think what I would ask everyone to do, if you could just do one thing today for this campaign, would be to check out that scorecard and share it with a few people in your social circles or in your families, because the more people that see this scorecard, the more that those 38 brands on that scorecard know that, you know, we're watching what they're doing, we're watching their improvements, we're commending them where necessary, but pushing for further change where also necessary. And I think that's like the 1 2-minute action that I would ask people to do today to really push that forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Monica. And just finally, one last question from the audience. Are certifications the answer?
Yeah, we get that question quite a lot as well. And I think, so a lot of companies are now relying on certification bodies like Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade and so on, to show, you know, sustainability. And it is a really, really good step for companies, especially given, you know, the situation that the industry was in recent years and how things are moving forward. But it's not a silver bullet, so it doesn't mean that this, you know, everything is done. There's lots more that companies can be doing above and beyond getting certified cocoa. And also one thing that I think not everyone might know is around the fact that many certification schemes follow a method called mass balance, whereby basically certified cocoa and non-certified cocoa becomes mixed at some point in the supply chain. And so that means maybe you've got a chocolate bar that has a specific certification logo on it, but it doesn't mean that every gram of cocoa that's gone into that chocolate bar is from a certified source. So again, certifications are great, but we still need more beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's really interesting when we hear as well what you've been explaining around the scorecard and the way that companies are performing. We have another question here just around, you know, why does Tony's Chocolonely, for example, get such a high mark if it came out saying it found child labour in its supply chains?
Yeah, so there was a bit of criticism in the media as well about this, and a bit of confusion, because Tony's came out and said, we found, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but this amount of children exposed to child labour in our supply chains. And people were saying, well, you know, there's supposed to be this leader in the area of child labour, and look at them. But the point is that there's approximately 1.56 million children exposed to child labour in cocoa production. So if chocolate companies aren't finding cases of child labour in their supply chain, then they're either not looking for it or they're not reporting it, or both. So finding cases is really, really key to be able to address the issue. You can't address an issue if you don't know about it. And then being transparent about those cases. So in the case of Tony's coming out and admitting it, I think is really admirable because it really helps improve accountability and progress across the whole industry, you know, like that. They're leading in this way, and hopefully will push other companies as well to be more transparent about, you know, what is the situation and what are we doing to address it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Monica. That was a really insightful overview of, you know, chocolate, child exploitation and supply chains. It's really important that we're aware of all the different nuances of how it occurs, and, you know, what the responsibilities are on businesses, but also what we as consumers can do. If there are any other questions on cocoa or child exploitation in cocoa, please do drop them in the chat. We're just going to move on now to our final campaign debrief, which is on our orphanage trafficking campaign. You know, some of you might already be familiar with the campaign. For others, you might not be as aware as, you know, how does orphanage trafficking occur? What is volunteerism when we talk about volunteerism, and what the links are between the two? So just to start off, volunteerism, and when we talk about tourism and combining it with volunteer work, is the term given to the practice of traveling abroad, often to other countries, and taking up volunteer work there as part of a travel trip or a holiday has become a popular trend, and it's created this boom in vacation packages that we've seen around the world involving volunteer work. Generally, volunteering abroad and these volunteerism packages are a rewarding experience, both for the volunteers and also host communities that welcome this type of volunteer work. But some placements can be actively harmful despite our best intentions, and we might question, what's wrong with volunteering or donating to an orphanage, particularly if these children look like they need our help. So the reality is that far too often we see fraudulent orphanages appearing with children who often have a living parent or a family member who can look after them. And we see these children being trafficked into these institutions in order to elicit donations from volunteers from abroad. Attracted by the funding that these orphanages receive and from donations and organisations offering these types of volunteerism placements, unscrupulous orphanage directors effectively have the ability to turn children into commodities by ensuring that there is a constant supply of children available in these institutions to attract funding. So within this context, traffickers know that they are able to exploit, for example, a family's perceived lack of options by offering to take their children away to give them an education and a better life opportunities. Instead, what we often see is that children are placed in institutions where they are exploited, they're abused, many are forced to work, and are at risk of being trafficked again to repeat the cycle and elicit more donations from tourists. What's important to remember is that children may not always have the ability to advocate for themselves. So it can take years for the relevant authorities to reunite them with their families. And in the meantime, people volunteering in orphanages may be completely unaware that some or even all of the children there, in fact, have families who could be looking after them. They may have been trafficked and forced to essentially perform for volunteers visiting the orphanage. Researchers and child's rights advocates have uncovered many examples of this occurring around the world. In 2017, Haiti is a context that's used a lot to describe how orphanage trafficking occurs. In Haiti, families had been paid around $75 to give their children away. And in a country where 1 in 4 people lives below the national poverty line of just $1.23 a day, this extreme poverty creates the conditions that drives families to sell or give their children to orphanages on these false promises that they'll receive an education, food, or care. So the situation in Haiti is replicated across the world. ECPAT reported on cases in Nepal where orphanage directors had reportedly refused to release children even when they had been requested to do so by the parents. And in one case, an orphanage director actually extorted a mother who had believed her 2 children were in school, but eventually found them at his orphanage. So instead of releasing the children to her, the orphanage director insisted the mother pay him equivalent of around $1,400 for the 2 years of supposed care at the orphanage. Sylvia, I know I can hear that somebody is banging next door, which is really poor timing, but hopefully they'll stop soon. Last year as well, authorities in Nigeria arrested a suspected orphanage trafficker who had reportedly kept 74 children in an institution under the guise of fostering them and providing them with an education. And it transpired that 11 of these children had in fact been abducted. And we're also seeing, reports, for example, in 2020, the United States Trafficking in Persons report even notes that foreigners sexually exploited children by donating to orphanages or promising to pay their school fees in order to gain access to children. So when we consider all of this and the fact that an estimated 5 million children around the world are living in orphanages, despite the fact that 80% of them have a family member that can look after them, it's clear that something isn't quite adding up. So that's why we decided to launch the Freedom United campaign back in 2018. We had a really simple request for organisations offering volunteerism placements. We were just asking, can you remove all advertisements and mention of voluntary orphanage placements on your website and commit to stop funding placements in orphanages? So over the past few years, it's been really fantastic to see tens of thousands of you in the Freedom United community taking action, signing petition, writing to orphanage volunteerism placement organisations. And we've been asking together, we've been asking the volunteerism sector to really re-examine its position on orphanage volunteer placements, as the evidence base linking these placements to trafficking just continues to build. So decades of research demonstrating the negative impacts of institutionalization on the child's development also has resulted in the child protection sector, widely accepting that orphanages and residential care settings just aren't the best place for a child to grow up. And with the added risk of trafficking in these institutions, volunteering in orphanage isn't a decision that should be taken lightly. Fortunately, orphanage trafficking has begun to be formally recognised by national and international agencies as a form of modern slavery, perpetuated by the opportunity presented to traffickers in the form of orphanage volunteering. In 2019, we were really glad to see a new resolution to the Child's Rights Convention, which called on states to take action to prevent trafficking and exploitation of children in care facilities or who are otherwise deprived of parental care, which includes addressing the harms related to volunteering programs at orphanages, including in the context of tourism. So seeing this language included was absolutely pivotal to the campaign. In the same year, the UK also issued official travel advice warning of the harms and risks of orphanage volunteering. So it's really encouraging to see the international community recognising how volunteering in orphanages can put children at risk of trafficking and abuse. But what we are continuing to see is that some volunteer tour operators are continuing to offer these placements. So having said all of that, I'd really like to open the floor to questions from the Freedom United community, you guys tuning in on Zoom and Facebook. If there's anything that you'd like to know about where the campaign is at the moment, please do share your questions now. So we have one question from a supporter on considering the progress of the campaign, what change still needs to happen. So as I mentioned, it's been really fantastic to see so many people in the Freedom United community reaching out to orphanage placements and volunteer tourism organisations. Over the past few years, we've worked with Global Vision International, African Impact, and most recently this year, Go Overseas also implemented a system to flag placements linked to childcare and orphanages, and flagging the risks and harms of orphanage trafficking, which is incredibly important. It's been really great to see progress in the campaign, but it still remains a significant global problem. So we saw, recently the charity Lumos published a really important global report on the patterns of institution-related trafficking. So we know that orphanage trafficking persists today, and from decades of research, it is evident that so much more still needs to be done. Community-based approaches, which seek to place children in families and offer support and resources as needed, offer a healthier model of care than institutionalization. And when we think about where does this leave volunteerism organizations offering these kinds of placements who might have concerns about no longer offering orphanage placements, what we would say to that is, it would be really key to redirect the compassion, the energy and resources of caring volunteers and organisations into community-based programmes, which is absolutely a good starting place and can really help to end the cycle of abuse perpetrated by traffickers and exploitative orphanages. Any other questions? Okay, we did have a question from Liliana earlier on that we didn't get a chance to cover, but I think this was related to our previous conversation around safe migration routes. So the question is, what is stopping the desired countries, UK, US, etc., to open delegations in so-called undesirable countries or their neighbours and offer some form of refuge and visas to avoid the trafficking completely? So I can go ahead and offer my perspectives on this. So I would say that the causes of migration, the reasons why people move and where they choose to move to are really complex and varied. I think what's really important is when a person might choose to move or might choose to take an irregular or particularly unsafe route to another country, say for example to the UK or the US, there is often a host of reasons why they would be doing that. So for example, many people seeking asylum choose to come to the UK, for example, because they might have family members here, they might speak the language, which, as we know, is really critical for people being able to integrate into society, get a job, become economically dependent, and so forth. So I would say that while it would be, it would be great for countries neighboring other countries where people might be deciding to leave, for them to have open border policies and be welcoming to them. I think we also need to think about the destination countries in mind and what their responsibilities are under international law, whether they are meeting their obligations under the Refugee Convention, and that people are being treated as human beings and their rights are being respected. And particularly if a person as well has been trafficked across a border, that might not have been, they might not have consented to that, they might not be aware of where they're being taken to. So survivors and victims of trafficking also need to be treated, have their rights respected, and make sure that they are entitled to the support that they should be receiving as a trafficking victim. Joanna, go ahead.
Thanks, Miriam. I just wanted to add to what you said and say, Liliana, I think it's a really obvious suggestion to my mind that countries do give opportunities for people to apply for visas or refuge or asylum or what have you, either where they are or near to where they've fled, so that they can come safely. And I think we do see that happen. Some countries do have such programs. Certainly the US is one country that comes to mind that does do that. I think, I don't know the sort of politics as to why that's not done more widely, but it certainly seems to me to be an obvious way of actually preventing trafficking if someone's got a way to seek refuge from the situation of danger. And I think it works particularly in obviously contexts of civil unrest and civil war where there are larger numbers. But yeah, definitely have sympathy for the suggestion, which I don't know, Liliana, but I assume that you're thinking that this would be sensible too.
Thanks, Joanna. Any other questions, or Monica, if you want to share any perspectives, go for it.
Yeah, well, I think just to echo what you've said, Joanna, and say that, even in the case of the US, there just aren't enough feasible visas for people to apply for. But in the case of refuge, like the idea of humanitarian visas is something that's been floated quite a lot. Why not give people the opportunity to apply for something that will let them travel safely, and by plane, for example, to the country where they're seeking asylum, and then go through the process, rather than having to spend all their money and put themselves at extreme risk on a long and dangerous journey. I think it's like back to the case of, it was possible for Ukrainians, why is it not possible for people from Afghanistan, people from Syria, people, all these other conflict zones that we're seeing people fleeing from? And I think it's, the way you phrased your question is exactly my response when people say that the Rwanda deal, for example, will somehow combat trafficking. Well, no, it won't, because by then the trafficking has happened. This is what will combat trafficking, making sure that you're intercepting the situation at the very root of it, and people don't have to pay traffickers or get involved with smugglers or trafficking in any way to get to where they want to be.
I guess I was being a little so I guess I shouldn't be so shy to say, but I think it's obvious that, the reason really is because there is a general resistance to immigration and a desire to control borders and keep them tight. And so there's a reluctance to offer those opportunities. I mean, even as Monica says, they are modest where they do exist in country, outside of the destination. And it actually just fits completely with policy, current immigration policy, which is all about making it as difficult as possible for certain people in particular to move around the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joanna and Monica, for sharing your thoughts. And thank you everyone for tuning in to our first ever deep dive event into the Freedom United community's top campaigns. It's been a really interesting conversation, and we're really grateful for everyone's questions and participation. You can get involved in all of the campaigns we've talked about right now at freedomunited.org/advocate. We're also excited to share that we'll be hosting a special panel event next Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, which is 3 p.m. UK time and 4 p.m. Central Eastern Time, with Labour rights advocates Malcolm Badali and Nick Meehan on Qatar, Kafal and the World Cup. So all the information to register is on our events page, on our website, our social media channels, and we'll also be sharing it in our news digest this week. So do sign up to receive it on our news page on our website. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you soon.